Hello one and all, this is Soulful Lordy, James Bullock, once again with another video game first impressions. This time around, Resident Evil Village for the PlayStation 4, PlayStation 5, Xbox One, Xbox Series X and S, Google Stadia, and PC. Resident Evil Village is the sequel to the 2017 Resident Evil 7 Biohazard. And one of the most obvious things about that is the fact that this game, just like Resident Evil 7, is in first-person perspective. You play as the protagonist from Resident Evil 7, Ethan Winters, as he tries to settle down in a rather quaint European village that, of course, now has been overrun by things like werewolves, vampires, general weird people, and, of course, just things that bump in the daytime. Because the majority of this game that I've seen thus far actually occurs in the daytime, all the while trying to search for his kidnapped daughter Rose. Now that doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of fright, there aren't a lot of scenes that will give you chills, will make you jump a little bit, and of course will shock you. Essentially, the second main stage that you have to go into is one of the creepiest things I've experienced in a Resident Evil game since the original days when I was playing on the PlayStation 1 and was just really getting into survival horror games. But unlike Resident Evil 7, which was a game that built off of the atmosphere of being stuck in a rundown home with psychotic family members trying to hunt you down, this game actually is a lot more action-oriented than Resident Evil 7 was at the very beginning. Resident Evil 7's most action-packed moments happen not only during boss fights, but mostly during the last third of the game. Whereas with Village, you are pretty much thrown into the action very quickly, not only because enemies are mounting, but also because you're given weaponry like a shotgun that wasn't given to you about midway through Resident Evil 7. As you progress through the town and eventually the first main hub, which is the castle, you discover that when enemies show up, they show up in numbers, they show up in mass, and it's really up to you to fight or flight. A lot of the time, fighting is the only option because of the close quarters, and that means utilizing a mixture of guns, your knife, and of course the block button that can reduce damage taken when hit or struck or even sliced. It's one of those things that still doesn't feel that natural because it's easily to forget the block button, especially when you're in the middle of a firefight. One of the biggest problems from Resident Evil 7 that returns to Resident Evil Village is the fact that every enemy takes a lot to be put down. While there are times you will get lucky and land a headshot and the enemy's head will explode, but there are other times where you will shoot an enemy with the same weapon point blank in the face and their head will not explode. They may go down, they may just rock a little bit, but they'll get right back up and come after you. Which means, of course, the enemies, as they are in almost every Resident Evil game, are bullet sponges. Thankfully, as I noted, since this game is a little bit more action-oriented than 7 was at the beginning, you're given a lot more supplies in terms of ammo and craftable items that you can make first aid kits that will allow you to survive the hordes and onslaughts that come after you very early in the game. There are a few puzzles here and there, though they're not as intricate or confusing as other puzzles in the Resident Evil games. A majority of the time, it's just going back to a certain section and trying to figure out what that code is. One of the more interesting aspects about the overall Village hub is the opening of the hub. It's not completely open. When you first get into it, there are keys that have to be found as you progress through the story. Certain animals and enemies will actually spawn later on in the game that they didn't in the first act. So the game is always keeping you on your toes, even when it looks like you're just going through a static environment. The boss battles that I've encountered thus far have been incredibly thrilling, but weren't as arduous as some of the boss battles, especially early in the game, that you encountered in Resident Evil 7. Technically, the game is good. It looks pretty good. It doesn't look as great as you would expect, especially on a current gen system, but of course with this being cross-generational, it's understandable as to why it doesn't look as profound as you would expect it to be on a PlayStation 5 or Xbox Series X, but it still looks great. Certain areas I've noticed that frame rate drops will occur. It seemed like more of the open environments you will see frame rate drops happen, but it's few and far between. I haven't had any hard crashes, no corrupted saves or anything like that. From a technical aspect in that regard, the game is flawless. Overall, if you enjoyed what Resident Evil 7 had to offer, especially with the more action-oriented portion of the game, then this will be a thoroughly enjoyable experience. If you're more of a fan of what the remakes provided, this may be a little bit on the fence for you, but I still say give it a try. For me personally, it's one of the most harrowing experiences I've had thus far in 2021. I am thoroughly enjoying it. I didn't expect to love it as much as I did. Even though I really enjoyed Resident Evil 7, I don't know why I didn't, but I didn't expect to like this as much as I have. And thus far, it has been one of the best experiences I've had playing a video game in 2021 thus far. So there you have it. This has been Soulful Lordy, James Bullock, once again with another video game first impressions. Resident Evil Village for the PlayStation 4, PlayStation 5, Xbox One, Xbox Series X and S, Google Stadia, and PC. Now if you don't mind, I'm trying to open a gigantic door, but this vampire lady chopped my hand off. And if I don't get away quickly, she'll do the same to the rest of my body and make me have no choice but to say, "Oh Lordy."